What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Hoops and Stuff podcast. I'm your host, Isaac, and today we're going to be covering some underrated fantasy football pickups for this year. So for your fantasy drafts, players that might have a good year compared to last year, and players that you can probably get later in the draft. Like right now, you could probably get them later in a draft. If you do play fantasy football, then I definitely recommend this video. I'm gonna be going over quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. I'll probably do about 3 per position. So some solid players that we can definitely see be picked up later into a draft, so that you're not using those high picks on a player that might potentially do bad but could potentially do good. It's more of like a high risk, high reward kind of thing. Starting off with quarterbacks, we have Deshaun Watson at our first quarterback. And I mean, obviously, he played only 6 games last year, and he had went, I think it was a whole season he went without, there was 2 seasons that he missed without playing any football at all. So for a quarterback like him, who was playing at a pretty elite level before he left the league, to miss a year and over a year and a half, over a season and a half, is obviously going to he's going to have to take time to adjust. And he got that part of the season last year to try to start adjusting to the Cleveland Browns offense. But I think their problem is the receivers. I mean, they just lost Jarvis Landry last year. So if they can get a couple of okay receivers, I mean, they do have Amari Cooper. So I mean, I do think that Deshaun Watson will be a solid player, even if his receivers aren't great. But I mean, Amari Cooper and Deshaun Watson, I feel like that would be a good duo, because I feel like Deshaun just needed, like I said, he just needed time to get used to playing again, because like I said, he was out for so long. So I think that he could definitely have a comeback year this year, and maybe we could even see him. Maybe we could see him get not most improved, comeback player of the year this year, if he can, like I said, if he can perform. But yeah, like I said, I think that his problem was just that he wasn't used to playing anymore. So he needed that time, and I think he's had enough time. So I think that if you can pick him up later in your drafts, then you should definitely go for him as your backup quarterback. But I mean, he wouldn't be a bad QB1, I'd say, for a fantasy team. Our next quarterback is going to be Russell Wilson. And yes, obviously, we did see Russell Wilson have a pretty bad season last year with his first year on the Broncos. But, I mean, Russell Wilson is one of the top quarterbacks of all time, I'd say. He's probably definitely top 20. So, for Russell Wilson, I mean, it's a new team. He was used to that Seahawks type of play, so he probably just wasn't used to being on that Denver team. So I feel like he's another player who just needs time to get used to their new team. But I think that if he can adjust, he could definitely be a solid quarterback. And like I said, again, he could be maybe a QB2. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, he threw for more yards this past season than he did the season previous, when his last year on Seattle. He threw for less yards than he did last season with his first season with Denver. And because his first season in Denver, he threw 3,524 yards, and his last season in Seattle, he threw 3,113 yards. So you can see that he's improving with his number of yards thrown. but I feel like he lacked in touchdowns this year. But I think that's just because of a lack of receivers like Jerry Jeudy. Obviously, we've seen Jerry Jeudy deal with injuries multiple times throughout his career. And I mean, Cortland Sutton is an okay receiver, but neither one of those players are a DK Metcalf. And I feel like that's Russell Wilson's problem. He just doesn't have the receivers that he needs with Denver. But if Jerry Jeudy does stay healthy, then I think that's where they have a good chance of Russell Wilson evolving into a solid player like he was in Seattle. I mean, he had a great career in Seattle. So I think that we could definitely see him bounce back if we can see Jerry Jeudy stay healthy. And I think that's the only factor that comes into play with Russell Wilson's season. A lot of people in fantasy leagues go for big-name quarterbacks like Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes. But sometimes you have to think of the underdogs who are maybe going to perform, like possibly could still perform, just maybe not going to be as good. And I mean, not obviously you're not going to have a perfect team. Not every single player is going to be great, but a player who I do think is going to be pretty solid and a pretty underrated pick this year is Daniel Jones. And I mean, obviously Daniel Jones just re-signed, and he had a pretty solid year last year with the Giants. And I mean, Saquon Barkley is a phenomenal running back, so there is that part where they're gonna probably run the ball quite a bit if Saquon can stay healthy again. But I mean, Daniel Jones, because he's not gonna get any fantasy points if they're just running with Saquon Barkley. He's not going to get any fantasy points. But I mean, he threw 15 touchdowns last season and 3,205 yards. So that shows that in the 4 years that he's played, he's gotten better and better and better. I mean, his first season he did phenomenal too. He threw for 24 touchdowns that season. So that shows that he has the potential to be a great player. But he's another player who I feel like doesn't have great receivers. So I feel like his receivers need to improve. They need to get better, or they need to get better receivers for Daniel Jones to be able to perform. But I mean, Daniel Jones had a pretty good season last year for fantasy, and I think that he could definitely have another solid season. And like I said just a couple minutes ago, you're not gonna have a perfect team. Not every position is gonna be the best player in that position. And I mean, even if you want to use Danny Dimes as a backup quarterback, that's a really solid option to come off your bench at your backup quarterback. Like if your starting quarterback gets hurt or it's their bye week, like he's definitely a player that you could sub in for one of those players. And I think that we could definitely see him giving the ball to Saquon a lot, but we also do have a lot of injuries with Saquon. I mean, obviously, like I said, last year he stayed healthy, but he wasn't very healthy for the rest of his career before that. So if that was just a fluke and he is going to keep getting injured again, then Danny Dimes is going to be just throwing. So he's the way to go. I am going to talk about one more quarterback, and that is Tua Tagovailoa. And Tua is still young, and obviously last year we've seen him deal with quite a few concussions, but I think that with everybody like laughing at Tua and putting him in the shadow, I think that's just going to encourage him to work harder, and he's going to come back stronger, and he's going to be fighting harder than he was last year. I mean, obviously, like, we've seen Tua suffer concussions and stuff like that. But I think that Tua could definitely be a great player if he can stay healthy. And, I mean, he played his third year last year, and, I mean, he played 13 games and threw for 3,500 yards, but they do have players like Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is one of the best receivers in the league, top 5 guaranteed. And I mean, they have Jalen Waddle, who's an up and coming younger player. And he's another player, like I said, that he could develop and become a player maybe like Tyreek Hill, who is a top 5 receiver in the league. And I mean, Tyreek Hill is going to be retiring soon. So Jalen Waddle is the future. Jalen Waddle and Tua are the future of that franchise. And I think that over the next few years, nobody, like this year, nobody really is going to go after Tua too early, just because of the fact that he did have those concussions last year and he was out for quite a bit. So they're going to want to go after a player that they know will probably stay healthy. But I think that Tua is going to come back way stronger than he was last year, and even more ready and aware of his surroundings. And I think that'll just help him prevent injuries like his concussions. Next up, we have wide receivers. And for wide receivers, our first one is going to be Odell Beckham Jr. Obviously, we just seen him sign with the Ravens, and he was a great player. Even on the Rams, he was a great player. But on the Giants, especially, he was a great player. So, I mean, obviously, he was not on a team last year, but I think he's another player like pretty much all the other players we talked about. I think he just needs time to adjust to getting back into the league. And once he adjusts to the Ravens offense, I think that he'll be a great pair with Lamar Jackson. I think that's all Lamar Jackson needed was a solid receiver, and now he's got one with OBJ. And I think that the Ravens will definitely be a dangerous team this year if OBJ can perform. But yeah, like I said, he obviously wasn't in the league last year because he was out with the injury, and he had the injury, and then he was a free agent. And as a Packers fan, I was really hoping he would come to the Packers, but he is definitely going to be an underrated player this year, especially with fantasy. And like I've done a fantasy league this year already, and he was picked like right at the end. So players towards the end like that are what you're looking for. Somebody who could be solid, and I feel like he could be a solid maybe like a solid flex player for your team. So I mean, like I said, solid option, but we just don't know how he's going to perform yet. I mean, he was good on the Giants, like I said, and then he ended up with Cleveland, where he wasn't as good, but he also had Baker Mayfield for his quarterback. And then he ended up with the Rams, where he ended up getting injured in the Super Bowl. But I mean, he was pretty solid there for them. But they also have Cooper Kupp, so they're going to be throwing to Cooper Kupp more too, obviously. But now that he's on the Ravens, they don't really have any solid receivers. I mean, they just drafted Zay Flowers, I think it was. But he's still young, so he's probably going to need time to develop. So I think that would definitely end up as a good duo between Lamar Jackson and Odell Beckham Jr. And he's definitely going to score some fantasy points if they can be. Sorry, the phone cut out, but as I was saying, they could definitely be a good duo if Odell can adjust to that Ravens offense. Our second receiver that we're going to be talking about is a man who is an absolute beast, and that man is Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas, before he was injured, he was insane. He was a great player, and I think that if he does end up coming back and playing and staying healthy, I think that he will be a phenomenal player for the Saints team to go along with not Drew Brees, wow, Derek Carr. I think he'll be a great fit to go with Derek Carr, and I think that Saints team is going to be good with Michael Thomas. I think that they're going to try to produce through Michael Thomas. And a lot of people are picking Olave over Thomas, but if Thomas can stay healthy, I think at the beginning they'll probably run Thomas, as their wide receiver too. But if he can stay healthy and prove himself, then I think that he could end up as wide receiver 1, and he will be getting more passes, like getting passed to more. So I definitely think that Thomas could have a explosive year this year, especially with he's an underdog. Nobody's expecting him to do great, so he's going to try to prove everybody wrong, and this is a perfect way to come back from an injury. And he is another player who I think could be a comeback player of the year if he like I said, if he can stay healthy. I think that he could be possible comeback player of the year, and he could definitely be a phenomenal player. I think that I think he could end up like what happened with Saquon, where Saquon Barkley kept getting injured and stuff. Then when he came back, he was a beast. So I think that same thing could happen with Michael Thomas, but I think it might take a couple of weeks for him to start up with the Saints, just because he's been out for so long. Another player who I've seen surprisingly go very late in fantasy drafts lately, or not go at all, is Gabe Davis, who had an explosive year last year. And with him being on the Bills, I mean, obviously they have Stephon Diggs, but there has been so many talks and rumors about Stephon Diggs possibly being traded away from the Bills within the next couple of seasons, possibly, or soon anyway. So I think that Gabe Davis, if Stephon Diggs does end up getting traded, Gabe Davis is going to be their wide receiver 1. But right now he's probably their wide receiver 2, and he had a great year last year. So I really don't understand why people aren't really like picking up Gabe Davis late into the draft. But I think that he will definitely be a underdog player, and I think that he should definitely be picked in these drafts just because he is a great player. And like I said, last year he was producing for the Bills, and he was putting up great numbers in fantasy. So I think that he could possibly do it again. I mean, he's still pretty young, so he still has time. He's going to develop, and he's going to get even better. So just like I said, he's going to be phenomenal. One more young wide receiver that I want to talk about is Brandon Aiyuk. And with the 49ers, they do have a good running game with Christian McCaffrey, who seemed to stay quite healthy last year. And they have Brock Purdy and Trey Lance, who are deciding between for the starting spot on the roster for quarterback. And they're both pretty solid young quarterbacks. Trey Lance seems to get hurt quite a bit, though. So I think Brock Purdy will end up being QB1 for that team. And Brock Purdy did amazing last year, so I think that he's going to be throwing some dots to Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk is a really athletic player. We've seen him literally jump over players. And I feel like with his athleticism, we could definitely see him be a phenomenal player. And I think that this year could definitely be his year. And he's definitely a player to look out for in your fantasy football leagues this year. And he could go undrafted depending on how many people are in your league. I mean, if you've got a league that has 12 people, maybe you could pick him up late into the draft. But if you have a league with like 6 or 8 people, you could definitely get him. You could probably get him at after the draft and pick him up in in free agency after the draft. Or if one of your players gets hurt, you could drop that player or put them in the IR and then pick up Brandon Aiyuk. He's a solid option, honestly. On to the running backs. To start, we have Dalvin Cook. And with my personal experiences, I did not see Dalvin Cook go very high just because he's a free agent this year. He is a free agent this year, but he was waived by the Vikings. So Dalvin Cook could definitely prove something but it depends on where he ends up, because if he does end up, because he said that he wants to play with DeAndre Hopkins. Wherever DeAndre Hopkins goes is where Dalvin Cook wants to go. And if he does end up going where DeAndre Hopkins goes, there's a possibility that DeAndre is going to go to the Patriots. And if Dalvin Cook goes to the Patriots, then he's going to have to share the snaps with Ramondre Stevenson. So he's not going to be getting the ball as much, and he's not going to be putting up those numbers that you need him to put up for your fantasy league. And that's just the thing to look out for, is where he ends up. I mean, maybe you could take the risk and pick him later into the draft, but I mean, he did have a pretty down season last year, but I think that he could come back from that season. I think maybe he just had one bad season, and maybe he'll come back this year and be a better player. But again, that's a really risky pick, I'd say. But it could definitely work out in your favor if he does end up being great this year. A running back who had a pretty solid season last season for the Kansas City Chiefs was Isaiah Pacheco, and I think that he could definitely have another solid season. Maybe you could run him at your flex position, maybe not at your running backs, or maybe he could just be a backup option for bye weeks. But I do think that he is definitely a solid option, and you could definitely have him on at least on your bench, just because, I mean, like, they have a couple of good running backs on the Chiefs, but Isaiah Pacheco is definitely a up and coming player who could definitely he definitely has potential. That's all I can say really right now about Isaiah Pacheco, but I think that he definitely has potential, and he could be a good pickup later into your draft. I wouldn't go picking him like 5th or 6th or even like 9th round, but you could probably pick him up pretty late and have it be a good pick for your team. I mean, even if you're just going to run him off the bench, it's not terrible. And finally, we have one of the most highly, I guess you could say, highly expected players to have done great last year. He's another young player. It's Cam Akers. Cam Akers was supposed to be a great player coming into the league. Then he tore his ACL or MCL, and he was out for the whole season. So I think that he definitely could end up coming back this season better, but last season I had him on my team and he did nothing. So if Cam Akers really wants to play in the NFL, he really has to be able to prove himself this year, and I think that he's going to try his hardest to do that. And I feel the Rams were not good at all last year, so possibly they could try to run the ball more, because I'm not sure what's going on with Matt Stafford. I'm pretty sure he was hurt at the end of the season last year, so we don't know what's going on with him. But if they do end up using a backup quarterback, they might be running the ball more, and that will give Cam Akers more. He'll get the ball more, and possibly he could do good. But he's a player that I would probably wait until the end or after the draft is over to pick him up, just because there's a very high chance that he's not going to do anything this season. For our tight ends, to start off, we have Cole Kmet. Cole Kmet is a beast, and if you actually watch the Bears play, you will see that Cole Kmet can perform. And I feel like for this Bears team, with a young, solid quarterback in Justin Fields, they are going to have a great season. And I feel like a part of that will be through Cole Kmet, just because he's such a beast on the field, and he's a really underrated tight end. I think he's going to be getting those touchdowns. He's going to be just he's going to use his body to just plow through players to get to that end zone. He's going to do what he has to do to get the win. And, I mean, obviously they're going to be throwing to players like Darnell Mooney as well, but I think that Cole Kmet will be a solid target for Justin Fields this year, just because, especially towards the end of the year last year, Kmet started to do phenomenal, and I think that he's just a really good, underrated player. For the Broncos, Greg Dulcich, he did pretty phenomenal last year towards the end of the season. He had a couple great games, and honestly, I don't think he's a bad option at your tight end. There's only like, I'd say 5 really good tight ends in the league right now. So, I mean, you might have to start a player like Dulcich, but that's really not a bad option. He's still good. He's not a star, obviously, but he's still a solid option for your team. And I mean, he's still going to put up some solid numbers for you. Maybe not every week, but a lot of weeks he will produce for you. And I think that if Russell Wilson can get better, then Dulcich could be a pretty good target for him. And he could just, like, a main part of fantasy football is scoring touchdowns. And I feel like that's what Dulcich could do for you if Russell Wilson can actually do something this year. Finally, we have Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys. And as much as I dislike the Dallas Cowboys, Dalton Schultz is a really underrated player. And I feel like a lot of people overlook him just because, I mean, there's players who like Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, players like that who are phenomenal tight ends. But Dalton Schultz is also a solid tight end, and he's very overlooked. But the Cowboys have so much receiver, like they have so many receivers, and with all those receivers, there's going to be less opportunities for you to get the ball. And being Dalton Schultz, tight ends are used more for blocking, I feel like. Like, if you're not a star tight end like Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews or somebody like that, like I just listed, then I feel like a lot of them are used for blocking. But Dalton Schultz could definitely work as a target for Dak Prescott this year. And, I mean, even if they run Cooper Rush is not a bad option. And he could definitely also give the ball to Dalton Schultz a little bit. But, I mean, they just lost Zeke, so they have one less running back, but they still do have Tony Pollard. So they might run a little less, and they might throw a little more. But, I mean, that just really depends on Tony Pollard's health. I mean, after he just had his, it was either a broken leg or a broken ankle. So if he can stay healthy, then they might run the ball more. But if he isn't doing too good, then they could potentially throw the ball more. And that could be good for Dalton Schultz as a tight end, just because there's not too many good tight ends in the league. That's going to be it for today's episode. If you liked the episode, leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next Sunday here on the Hoops and Stuff podcast.